Everyone's been muted upon entry, but we'll open it up to some questions following the presentation. You can raise your hand as well as type any questions in the chat box below. Today we have one of our own Center for Cognitive Neurology neurologist, Dr. Joel Salinas. Dr. Salinas graduated from Cornell University, where he then proceeded to obtain his MD as well as his MBA from the University of Miami. And then in 2016, received his Master of Science degree in epidemiology from Harvard. Dr. Salinas currently works within our Department of Neurology as the research director for the Universal and Nuanced Insights for Cognitive Resilience Lab, or Unicorn Lab, as an assistant professor within neurology and a neurologist at NYU and the Pearl Barlow Memory Center. So welcome, Dr. Salinas.
Thank you. Well, hello. Thank you for joining. Today I'll be talking about how to promote brain health through socialization, or as I like to say, how your social life might be helping or harming your brain. And some of the things that we will be reviewing today is one is why I care about this topic. We'll also review a little bit about kind of what we're describing when I mention this, and then we'll go through implications of this information as well as some future directions. So if we think about kind of the entire lifespan of an individual, at some point, their brain, in here kind of depicted as kind of like a healthy brain, as kind of one would expect, kind of its brain cells functioning and a person's kind of cognitive functions being completely intact. There's a switch over where in this transition, there's the development of amyloid plaque as well as kind of inflammatory changes in the brain and neurofibrillary tangles, which is all part of what we call Alzheimer's disease, which then kind of becomes manifest as cognitive impairment and dementia. But if we were to zoom out even earlier in the course of this person's life, we might see something that resembles more like a stream. So in this model on the right, we've got the situation where somebody develops kind of brain disease, but before that, kind of at the downstream end of this kind of stream, there's the typical risk factors that are tied to increased risk of dementia, things like diabetes and high blood pressure and small vessel degeneration. If we go up higher in the stream, we begin to see kind of risks of risk factors, things like poor diet, chronic stress, exposure to pollutants, low physical activity, and even smoking. And some of the work that I do is really focused on kind of the furthest upstream, kind of the risks of risk factors. And the term for this is often used as social determinants of health or psychosocial determinants of health. And there's a very long list, but a lot of these, as you can see, are a combination of kind of environmental and kind of social, structural, and cultural type of kind of elements and factors. And this has become kind of really critical and really kind of notable over the course of the pandemic that we've been in. And this is just kind of a sample report looking at levels of psychological distress and people's perception of loneliness, comparing from 2018 to 2020, kind of at the peak of the pandemic. And there was notable increases across many of these areas, regardless of what your age or your kind of living situation is. And in these specific factors, that there can be one that's really kind of captivated me over and over again is kind of what's been considered kind of like having a rich social network, which is more kind of considered a protective factor. And so the way that this has typically been thought of is that people who are more socially isolated, meaning they have very little kind of social contacts, are more likely to develop things like stroke and dementia. But I would like to nuance this a little bit more by introducing another term called social relationships. Now, social relationships exist when two or more people influence each other's thoughts, feelings, and or behaviors. And we can deconstruct this further across three different dimensions: structure, function, and self-perception. On the side of structure, that would be kind of a person's social network. And things that we can measure from a person's social network are things like what's called the ego, kind of the self or the person that we're interested in looking at; alters, which is everybody else in the network; and then ties, which are the connections that the person has with the other people in the network. And then there's these simple measures that can be taken from a network, which includes the number of connections that a person has, as well as the density of those networks, meaning kind of how those different connections of people are connected to each other. So here's one example of how kind of this network level phenomena can kind of emerge. So this is a video of the Framingham Heart Study network. This is a full network of people in a community. Each kind of node here, each spot represents an individual. And what we're looking at is the network over time. Over the course of 32 years, connections are forming and breaking. The size of each node represents their body mass index. And if they are green, they are not obese. And if they're yellow, they would be defined as obese based off of body mass index. And what you see is that over time, the entire network becomes more obese. But there's also a couple of other things that kind of appear. One is that there seems to be some kind of clustering among some of these people, where you have obese people clustering together and non-obese clustering together. You also see that the location of kind of where people are in the network, kind of on the outsides versus on the inside of the network, also kind of affects a person's overall risk. And there's a few different kind of ways of thinking about kind of why or how this happens. One is what's called induction, which some people might call like peer pressure, basically that the behavior of one person in a network influences another person's behavior and so on. Homophily, another way to kind of think about this is birds of a feather flock together. Basically, imagine you've got a group of people who really enjoy drinking beer and eating muffins, and that they might be more likely to hang out with other people who like to drink beer and muffins. And then the third kind of factor here is what's called confounding, which basically has to do with kind of where you are geographically. Maybe the people that are close to your network, they all live as well as with you in an area that has a lot of fast food restaurants, but not a lot of healthy food options. And that's kind of what's explaining that pattern. In the second dimension of kind of function, that would be social support, and that can be broken down into different kind of subtypes. One category is what's called instrumental or financial support, which is really kind of the ability to have somebody help you with your chores or getting things done, or even providing a loan if needed. Informational support has more to do with kind of education and awareness of different things. Appraisal and companionship has more to do with the sense that you have somebody available there to provide either affection or social contact, or to be there as an available listener. And then emotional support is more specific to when you're experiencing kind of distress of some sort, that there are people in the network or around you that are able to help you through that. And in this third category of self-perception, the third dimension, we have loneliness, which can be defined as perceived social isolation. So a very important to kind of thing to distinguish here is that you can have a lot of people in your network and still feel lonely. And another way of kind of thinking about this term is to say that it is the distress that a person experiences from the difference between what they expect in terms of social support and what they perceive as the social support that they receive, meaning that they feel like they're not getting enough social support, that not meeting their needs. And so as we kind of evolve kind of this model from social isolation to social relationships, we begin to see some interesting relationships kind of with brain health pretty broadly. One I've already kind of alluded to, which was kind of the spread of obesity across a social network. This specifically is the Framingham Heart Study Network, but this has also been seen with habits like smoking and even things like happiness, where basically having somebody in your network, as an example, who smokes increases the likelihood that you will smoke, but that kind of increase in risk on yourself actually increases still if your friend's friend smokes, and even if your friend's friend's friend smokes. And this is true for obesity as well as for happiness. Other things that can be seen in relation to brain health with social relationships is that there is an increase in the incidence of stroke in people who have less social support. It's also seen that people who have kind of smaller social networks tend to have a higher risk of dementia. And then people who experience higher levels of social support are more likely to have a slowing in kind of the rate of cognitive decline that they might have. Another example of this is this study from the Health and Retirement Study, looking at over 16,000 people from 1998 to 2004. And what they saw here was that looking at memory scores over time, when they divided the group of participants into those that had high social integration and another group being those that had low social integration based off of information they had available about the size of the networks and kind of how involved they were in volunteering and other activities, when they followed them over time, it seemed that the people that were in the high social integration group, their decline in memory function was actually slower compared to those that had low social integration. This has also been seen in relation to loneliness, where people who are more lonely are more likely to have a faster cognitive decline over time. And these effects are actually quite different from depression. Even though loneliness and depression have some relationship to each other, it seems that loneliness has a very kind of specific relationship here when it comes to cognitive decline. And this is something that our group looked at using the Framingham Heart Study, looking at how loneliness was tied to the rate or the risk of developing dementia in 10 years, as well as how that related with MRI measures and measures of cognitive functioning. And here's just an example of the pattern overall. So looking at the entire Framingham Heart Study, in this specific kind of group of the Framingham Heart Study, what we see is that over the course of 10 years, people who said that they felt lonely 3 or more days in the past week actually had an increase in risk compared to those that were not lonely. And that risk is even kind of more extreme when we look at a higher risk subgroup, which is people who are younger than age 80 and who do not have a very typical genetic risk factor for dementia, which is the ApoE4 allele. And what's seen here is that these people who are lonely and who are younger than age 80 and don't have any major genetic risk factors, actually their risk is tripled compared to those people that are not lonely. And that may be due to the biological or genetic differences may be driving some risk in the more general group, but when we look at those that don't typically have age or genetic kind of risk factors, these types of psychosocial factors may have a greater influence. And so this kind of raises the question about how is it that social relationships are tied to cognitive function and age-related brain pathology? Like what's in between there? And this is a review that we put together looking at the different kind of biological mechanisms that might explain some of the links between social isolation and loneliness with kind of poor neurologic outcomes. And I would say that the list is pretty varied, where it can include things like increases in inflammation, it can include changes in actual brain volume, it can include inhibiting your brain cells' ability to repair themselves, as well as the ability for brain cells to connect with each other. Include kind of increased risk of anxiety and depression. It can include vascular injury, issues with sleep, and on and on. In one study, looking at levels of loneliness and levels of amyloid plaque in the brain using amyloid PET scans, what was seen is that actually people who have higher levels of loneliness had incrementally higher levels of this amyloid plaque accumulating in their brain. It's unclear whether this suggests that people who are more lonely increase the propensity for having amyloid plaque, or people who have higher burden of amyloid plaque may have this kind of underlying neuropathological changes being expressed in the form of loneliness symptoms. Looking at this using kind of tau PET imaging, what was seen is that, again, the higher the level of loneliness, the higher the level of pathology, but in this case, it was specific to a region of the brain, which would be the right entorhinal cortex, having higher levels of tau, and this kind of part of the brain does have some ties to kind of social cognition and social perception. Looking at the potential kind of mechanisms involved in kind of social support and social networks, that can also include things like access to resources and material goods, the specific functions of social support, as I described earlier, some potential like contagion type of effects that can be seen from person-to-person contact. This can include also social engagement. So whether there's any kind of cognitive stimulation going on, as well as social influence and how that changes kind of a person's behavior. And then if we were to kind of summarize the potential pathways here, I would say that there's sort of three main ones. One is cognitive reserve, basically this kind of potential buffer that can exist where regardless of the amount of underlying kind of potentially pathological changes or kind of age-related changes going on in the brain, a person's level of functioning remains about the same. It can include a vascular pathway that has more to do with vascular injury and how it relates to brain health. And then another pathway relates to stress and hormonal changes and what we know about how stress relates to kind of higher levels of things like inflammation in the body. We looked at this a little bit deeper in the Framing of a Heart study, looking at one, how specific dimensions of social support related to stroke and dementia, as well as how they related with a special type of molecule called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which helps to repair brain cells and helps kind of brain cells connect with each other. And what we saw was that not only were people who had lower levels of listener availability, meaning having somebody available to listen to you most or all the time, and people who had lower levels of emotional support tied to higher risk of stroke and dementia, but it seemed that this relationship seemed to be linked together through this pathway that might involve brain-derived neurotrophic factor, meaning that it's possible that in people who are receiving higher levels of social support in the form of emotional support or listener availability, they may have higher levels of the serum brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so we looked into this even further, looking at how different types of social support then related to changes in the brain, and specifically this kind of cognitive reserve pathway or resilience pathway. And what we saw is that across all of the different types of social support that a person can have, there was one type of social support that was quite special compared to the others, which was listener availability. Specifically, can you count on anyone to listen to you when you need to talk? And what we saw was that in a specific group of people, those that were younger than age 65, with every decline in brain volume that they had, those that had low listener availability had a decline in cognitive age by about 4 years compared to those that had high listener availability. So basically, it seemed like people who had low listener availability had a brain that was about 4 years, kind of functioning 4 years older compared to somebody who had high listener availability. And another way of kind of representing how this looks is a graph like this, where what you see is that the people who have high listener availability here in blue seem to have pretty stable functioning overall in kind of their global cognition compared to people with low listener availability, where the smaller the brain volume that they may have, the more likely that they are going to have that expressed with lower cognitive functioning. So then kind of looking forward, one of the things that we really want to understand is how to intervene here. And that might involve delving deeper into the biology of how these kind of things are tied together, capturing more objective and continuous and quantitative measures of kind of social relationships, to then develop kind of targeted interventions that will help to increase or improve social integration, which will then kind of ideally lead to preserve brain health. But one of the big challenges here is kind of really understanding what is the best measure to understand these links with early disease. Is it using neuropsychological test scores? And there are many types of neuropsychological tests, whether it relates to kind of specifically looking at memory or looking at tasks like TRAILS B-A, which has to do with kind of visual spatial processing and regulating and task switching, as well as kind of just a measure of global cognition. And there are many different types, including one called the PAC-5, which is really designed to look, or seems to be more sensitive to differentiating whether somebody has underlying amyloid kind of plaque or not. And with MRI measures, it's still unclear whether we should be looking at the entire volume of the brain or specific regions of the brain like the hippocampus, or some of these kind of signature measures, which are a collection of regions. And then there's kind of newer kind of imaging methods like functional connectivity MRI and tau and amyloid PET measures, and forthcoming, there will be things like PET scans that are able to look at levels of inflammation in the brain. And the overall kind of goal really here is to understand what's going on when somebody has developed disease in terms of kind of how these social relationship factors are changing or influencing the risk of that, kind of seeing where the main kind of signal is compared to the noise. Looking earlier in the course of that disease development and looking at what's causing or these neuropathological changes, and then going even earlier to what's called preclinical disease, meaning before somebody's even developed any kind of cognitive signs. Can we get earlier in the course and use maybe some of these measures to identify whether somebody is at a higher risk of having kind of Alzheimer's disease, so that way they can be kind of considered for potential preventive interventions. So when we are looking at kind of specific aspects of social relationship, I think it's important to get closer to the actual behavior that's involved in social relationships. With social networks, some of the things that emerge and hasn't been done quite as well overall in the past is really understanding the nuances between a person's kind of social network size and kind of the overall kind of connectivity of that network. So an example of that, let's say this person here, let's call her Anne, and this person here, let's say her name is Betty. Anne may have 4 people that she says are close in her life, versus Betty has 5 people in her life. And kind of what we might expect is that maybe that means that Betty has more support from that group of 5 people compared to Anne, because she has 1 more person. But if we look at measures like density or constraint, which has to do with how closely knit and how closely connected the people in the network are, what we can see is that maybe there's some different relationships, that maybe even though Anne has a smaller network, it's more closely knit compared to Betty's, which even though her network is larger, it's more loosely knit because it's made up of people in different organizations or different kind of groups or settings. And the amount of support that maybe she's getting from that would be different compared to Anne. Some of this has been studied in multiple sclerosis, where personal social networks have been measured. This is just kind of displaying the networks in this one study looking at about 1,500 people from smallest to largest, as well as looking at the health habits within that social network. And what it can be seen there is that people who had more unhealthy habits in people who had more healthy habits in their network, and their networks were larger or more connected, kind of like this person right here, actually had a lower risk of having functional decline in the setting of multiple sclerosis, including disability. Some of these measures are already available for researchers to use, where it just takes a matter of answering a few questions to both assess kind of what a person's social network is, how strong or weak the ties are, and what kinds of health habits they have. And there's also the potential to use what's called digital phenotyping, which is taking some of the measures that are already being collected by your smartphone and kind of considering it like a pocket neurologist to use kind of the phone sensors and how you interact with your phone, and kind of even voice and speech analysis that are capable on the phone to measure some changes, especially earlier on. And this kind of fits in this larger model where many of the tools that are already developed and exist right now are focused on when people have clinical disease already, to kind of moving things a little bit earlier before people develop symptoms of underlying disease, where we can use things like this kind of set of measures from a person's smartphone to look at things like how anxious they are or how attached they are, how much they're communicating with other people. An example of an app like that was designed by researchers for researchers is called Beely, where it's easy for participants to kind of enroll and also for researchers to replicate other studies. And you can bring in all sorts of different measures. And I think what's most interesting here is measures that are passive, of kind of that don't involve you having to interact with your phone. And in particular, for the work that we do, would be kind of measures of social communication, or what we call kind of call log or communication metadata. And here's just kind of a visualization of what this data collection can look like, where over the course of about 24 hours, so this is like the beginning of the day, this is the end of the day, you can see that a person may be receiving text messages or kind of receiving calls. You can see kind of the directionality of the text messages and the calls as well. And you can also get a sense of the duration of this communication. Here's another display of what this could look like in terms of kind of outgoing and incoming calls, outgoing and incoming text messages, including kind of the length of those text messages, and would be more interested in than just kind of comparing how one person compares to other people of similar age and sex. It would be really focusing in on how you compare to yourself over time, and really to give us a sense of whether things are changing. And with a lot of this kind of research that I've kind of presented here, you might be wondering to yourself, like, well, what can we do now? I think there's a couple of things that I'll point out. One, and I like this kind of visualization, which is to show, if we looked at all of the different types of studies reporting an association or not reporting an association with Alzheimer's disease and dementia and kind of issues of cognitive functioning, what we can see is over orders of magnitude, there are many more studies that are showing kind of clear associations, which really help to reinforce this idea that there is across our lifespan a collection of risk factors that can come into our lives, as well as protective factors that come into our lives. And this matter of rich social networks is one that we really shouldn't be ignoring. The AARP gives some really kind of straightforward recommendations that involves finding new ways to stimulate your brain and challenge the way that you think. And I would underline how important it is that those activities are really challenging the way that you think to increase the likelihood that you'll form new brain connections. Also choosing activities that involve both mental and physical engagement and stimulation. So that might mean learning dance or learning a new kind of sport or a new skill. And if you can add in another layer, which is social engagement and a sense of purpose, that's even better. So dance, again, could be an example of that, but also kind of volunteering may be an opportunity to kind of bring all those things in. And to really kind of zoom out on this kind of work, what's really been seen over and over again is that as we age, people who feel connected and feel like they have a purpose in life typically have better brain health over the long term. And some of the simple things that a person can do can include joining a group, getting a pet, teaching somebody something new, volunteering or helping others, using or learning to use technology to stay connected. And even if it's a matter of sharing a smile, as sometimes it can be quite awkward, there are likely other people around you who are also feeling isolated or lonely, and being able to kind of accept the awkwardness and then finding opportunities to share in activities, of course, and always in safe ways, would be a way to help to promote the likelihood that you'll be able to make a new connection, and especially one that is supportive of you, and maybe that you can be supportive of them. So even though there isn't a cure yet for many age-related brain diseases, there may be a way to delay and eventually prevent these diseases in ways that are accessible and reachable for many of us. And one thing that I'll always kind of emphasize here is that the World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And this kind of aspect of social well-being, I think, often gets missed. And I think it's one that we would benefit from, because it's one of the legs of this kind of three-legged stool. And without it, we are not setting ourselves up as well as we could be. So to summarize, social relationships are essential for brain health, especially social isolation and loneliness when they're prevented. By developing better tools to understand the link between social relationships and brain health, we'll be able to translate some of these findings into promising interventions. And meanwhile, there's a lot that we can do right now. And just to kind of acknowledge that it takes a village to do a lot of this work. And I just wanted to thank the members of our lab here and the members of the NYU Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and other collaborators at the Framingham Heart Study at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health and the Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Salinas. That was wonderful.